They called me a traitor, and I hadn't even said a word. But no one knew that the only place my heart truly beat was in those hidden hours before dawn, with a man who was never supposed to exist. I know it sounds wrong, but in that war, what saved me wasn't the flag. It wasn't the training. It was him. A man in the wrong uniform, on the wrong side, saying my name in a language no one else could understand. They taught me that love like that was betrayal. But no one taught me what to do when that very love is what keeps you breathing. Night after night, while the world crumbles around you, all we had was the darkness before morning. That's all we were given to exist. And somehow, it was enough. Maybe you've spent your whole life believing love and war don't mix. That duty always comes before feeling. But what if, right in the middle of chaos, pain, and confusion, that's where we find the piece of ourselves that's most human? I'm not here to defend anything. I'm here to confess. Because some things only make sense once they're gone. And some people, even when they vanish, keep coming back. If only in the sound of water brushing against the sides of your home. This is my story. A war story you'll never find in books. A story too full of feeling to be spoken aloud by just anyone. But I kept every piece of it with me. In my pockets, in the floorboards, in my skin. Today I chose to tell it. And if you listen all the way through, maybe you'll find a part of yourself hidden in these memories too. My name is Lillie Ruth Jefferson. I'm 87 years old, and I still wear the necklace he tied around my neck with hands burned by war. I live in an old trailer now, parked beside a quiet lake deep in Minnesota. The windows stay foggy, and the scent of wet wood never leaves. Sometimes I hear the wind tapping the hull and close my eyes, like he's still calling me from the other side of the water. Because it was in the water that we met, and it was in the middle of the night that we let ourselves exist. I was a nurse during the secret war in Cambodia. There were no maps, no promises, just bodies moving through the jungle, and pain soaked into the white cloth I kept tied at my waist. But it was there, in the sounds nobody wanted to hear, that he showed up, with the wrong uniform, the wrong tongue, and the right heart. They told me it was betrayal, but what we lived was the only real thing in that hell. They called me useless when I came back, but the front gate of my sister's house only exists because I held the soldier who would have erased her name from this world. So sit with me a while, take a deep breath, let the water carry you, and listen with an open heart. I won't promise you answers, but I can promise that, by the end, you'll understand why some war stories never make it into books, because they're too full of feeling to fit on a page. And if you feel like this story belongs to you in any way, subscribe to the channel and share it. Some things, only we understand. My first night in Cambodia felt like it had been stitched together from scraps of nightmares someone tried to hide beneath the world. I still remember the sound of the helicopter flying away, small against the wide sky like it was running too. The heat stuck to my skin like a monster, an invisible weight melting my bones from the inside out. Everything smelled of metal, smoke, and some slow-rotting fruit in the trees. They gave me a thin, damp sheet and told me that was my bed. But to me, bed was what my grandma used to say when she sprinkled lavender on the pillows. That wasn't a bed. It was bare earth with a rickety bamboo frame and nails that groaned like they were in pain. And I was in pain, too. Not the kind that bleeds, but the other kind. The kind that comes from being dropped into a war story without knowing your role in it. It was my first day as a nurse on that river mission. I'd been assigned to the makeshift emergency ward, where the bodies arrived before their names. Men torn apart by shrapnel, boys burned, eyes still open even after the heartbeat was gone. There was a rhythm, a kind of choreography everyone else seemed to know, except me. I felt like a wrong note in a song made of sorrow. My hands shook so badly while holding the forceps that I had to bite my lip until I tasted blood. One of the doctors, a woman with a shaved head and a dry accent, looked at me with pity. She didn't say a word, but she was the one who left a canteen next to my makeshift mattress. That was the first time I cried in silence, because crying there felt almost offensive, like tears were trying to compete with the pain of others. That night, when they finally let me lie down for 2 hours, the sheet was still soaked. I couldn't tell if it was from sweat, rain, or some leftover sadness that had soaked in before me. The tarp above the shelter shuddered with the wind from distant blasts, and every crack made me curl in on myself, like I could disappear into my own skin. And that's when I heard it. A low sound. Something like breathing. It wasn't someone snoring. It wasn't the leaves. It was something more human, more intimate. I got up slowly, heart hammering against my ribs, and followed the sound to the back of the infirmary, where we kept boxes of gauze, syringes, and bloodied rags. And there he was, sitting, leaning against one of the wooden posts, his head tilted to the side. The first thing I noticed was that his uniform wasn't ours. And the second, his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, like he was just waiting for the sky to fall. He was young in a way war shouldn't know. Brown skin, dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. A deep gash ran across his stomach, one that would need too many stitches. I wanted to scream, but something in his eyes stopped me. A silent plea, a warning whispered straight through his gaze. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, until he slowly moved his hand, like he was gripping his own fear, and pointed to his belt. There was a handkerchief tied there, a red square, stained but clean, like it was the only piece of dignity he had left. I took it gently, not knowing what to do. And then he spoke. I didn't understand, but the melody of his voice, it was almost beautiful, like he was trying to tell me why he was there, why he crossed to the wrong side of the war, why he was still breathing. But all I could think was, I can't let him die here, like this, alone, and nameless. Back at my mattress, I couldn't sleep. I took the wet sheet, folded one corner, and brought it to my face. It smelled like everything I wanted to forget. And at the same time, it was all I had. I felt a strange dizziness, a vertigo that came not from my body but from my soul. It was like, in that moment, I crossed an invisible line, from obedient nurse to hidden woman, from trained volunteer to accomplice in something I couldn't even name. For the first time, war stopped being a duty and started to whisper like a dilemma. By morning, he was gone. No record, no word. Just a trail of dried blood leading to the back of the shelter. I spent the whole day trying not to ask, but my eyes kept asking anyway. No one answered. No one ever did. But the red handkerchief stayed with me. I tucked it into the pocket of my overalls, alongside the gauze and keys to the supply locker. And every time I touched that rough fabric, it was like I was telling him, "You still exist. I still remember." The war story they told me before I got on the plane was all maps, strategies, and dates. But the real story, the one I lived and never wrote down, started there, with that soaked sheet, that breath in the dark, that red handkerchief. And that's when I realized some encounters last no more than a single night. But even so, they're worth more than a lifetime lived on the right side. I'd already learned, in those first few days in Cambodia, that there were two kinds of wounds in that war, the ones that bled and the ones that shamed. The first we rushed to treat, with clean bandages and our hearts lodged in our throats. The second got ignored, because touching it was like opening a grave no one wanted disturbed. It was on a gray morning, covered in thick fog, and an eerie silence hanging over camp, that he came back. Or rather, was brought back, wrapped in a filthy blanket, carried by two patrol boys who barely looked old enough to shave. They dumped his body at the back of the supply hut like they were unloading something unwanted, then walked off without a word. I was sorting syringes and trying to remember the last time I'd eaten something solid when I felt the air change. It's strange to say, but his presence changed the air. Like the world held its breath for a moment, just trying to figure out if it was dream or danger. I ran to the corner where they'd left the bundle, and my heart sank into my stomach the second I saw his face. It was him, the boy in the wrong uniform. Same half-closed eyes, cracked lips, neck stained with dirt and sweat, and that same hand clutching the handkerchief, like it was his identity, his last bit of safety. The gash across his abdomen had split wider. There was pus, redness, and a smell only someone who's tended to deep infections would recognize. It was a live wound, throbbing, begging for help, and no one came. I asked the nurse on duty if there were any orders about him. He shot me a sharp, almost annoyed look, and said only, "He's not one of ours." Those 4 words echoed inside me like a sentence, like he was a misplaced object, a battlefield mistake. Not one of ours. But he bled like any other, shivered like any other, and breathed. He was still breathing. That's what kept me there. The fact that, despite everything, he hadn't let go yet. I stepped closer quietly, like even caring for him could be seen as a crime. I sat beside him, took off my gloves, and placed my hand on his chest. Cold, but steady. His heart was beating, weak but there, almost like a plea. A whisper I was the only one who could hear. I cut open his shirt with surgical scissors, cleaned the skin with searing alcohol, and started stitching. Alone. No protocol, no permission. Just the scraps of courage left in me after weeks of horror. Every stitch was a silent conversation between us. He groaned sometimes. Other times he just turned his face away like trying to escape the pain. At one point, he spoke. A short sentence. Whispered. I didn't understand the words, but the sound was familiar. It was the same voice from the night we first met. And I realized he was repeating the same word, over and over. The tone was both pleading and resigned, like he was saying, "If it's you, then it's okay." The wound was too deep to close completely. I knew that. So I improvised a dressing with cotton and clean cloth, wrapped it in elastic and left the rest up to his body. Bodies sometimes know how to survive, even when the soul already gave up. The problem is, in a place like that, the body wasn't always the heaviest thing. Guilt weighed more. Doubt, even more. For the next 2 days, I treated him in secret. I brought water mixed with salt and sugar. I drained pus with warm cloth. I cleaned his skin with care. I spoke to him in a low voice, like we were 2 kids pretending to exist. He said very little, almost nothing. But his eyes, they spoke whole worlds. On the 3rd night, someone followed me. A new nurse, who hadn't yet learned to hide curiosity behind discipline. She saw me leaving the infirmary with a bowl in my hands and asked where I was going. I said I needed to discard materials. She smirked. Didn't believe me. I knew it. That night I shook with fear. I felt like, at any moment, someone would pull back the top and catch us. Him, still wounded. Me, even more exposed. But no one came. And deep down, I think they all knew, and chose silence, because there are things the battlefield won't allow, but doesn't quite have the courage to stop. Silence became a kind of cowardly complicity, but it was all we had. He got better, little by little. The fever broke, his breath came easier. And one night, when I came to change the bandage, I found the red handkerchief folded beside my mug, and on top of it, a tiny white flower, picked from some bush around camp. It was the most intimate gesture I've ever received. Not a kiss, not a touch, a recognition. A quiet thank you for tending the wound everyone else refused to see. And for a second, just one, I wished the world would stop there, that no one else would find him, that he could stay with me, hidden in the leaves, in a place untouched by time. But war never lets that happen. By morning he was gone again, and all that was left was the handkerchief and the memory of a wound that wasn't mine, but had become part of my body. I was never good with languages. In school, I struggled even with Spanish, and I only learned how to spell pharmacy because my mom taped the word on the bathroom cabinet. But there, deep in the Cambodian jungle, between flies landing on gauze and emergency sirens screaming out of nowhere, his language started slipping into me in a way no class ever could. It wasn't a language made of just words. It was made of pauses, of lowered eyes, of fingers trembling while folding a handkerchief, of slouched shoulders silently asking to be held without ever saying so. That's how I started to understand what he meant, even when I couldn't understand what he said. He murmured things that to anyone else might have sounded like noise. But to me, it was music. A war story whispered through clenched teeth, like he was afraid the wind might carry away what little he had left. Every night I came to change his dressings, he gave me a new word. And each time he said my name with that accent, his throat still torn by pain, I felt like I was being renamed. Like my name only truly existed when it came out of his mouth. A name spoken with hesitation but never fear, with weariness but never resentment. No one had ever said my name like that, like it was too delicate to be mistreated. And me, I started to answer, not with words, but with gestures. A cloth wiped twice in the same direction, a glass of water left before he asked, a long sigh while I stitched his skin again. That's how we talked, a secret language made of small rituals. The others thought I was just doing my job. But what we had was something else. It was like a silent dance, a prayer that only made sense in the dark, when everyone else slept and the night was ours. Once, he touched my shoulder and pointed to the moon. He said a long sentence, too long for my tired memory. Then he touched his own chest and pointed at me. And then he said my name. That's when I realized he was teaching me how to feel, not how to speak. He was giving me meaning, not translation. It was like his language wasn't made of grammar, but of scars. And his scars knew how to speak to mine. I wrote everything down, on bits of gauze paper, hid them in my boots. Sounds I couldn't pronounce but drew like parts of a map. Sometimes he laughed at me, a soft, almost childlike laugh. And when he laughed, he coughed. And when he coughed, he bled. And then I stitched him back up, and he fell quiet again. It was a choreography, and every silence between us said more than any official translation ever could. One night, when the rain hit the top like a ritual drum, he taught me a word that meant return, or something close. He made me repeat it, and said it with me, over and over, until my tongue stopped tripping. Then he looked at me so deeply I had to turn away, because I understood. He wasn't talking about returning to camp. He meant returning to life, to having a name again, to being someone, and maybe to coming back to me. But I didn't know if he ever could, or if I'd be able to let him go. I started dreaming in words that weren't mine, whole phrases I'd never heard outside that place. And in the middle of those dreams, he'd appear, sometimes wounded, sometimes smiling, sometimes faceless, but always holding that red handkerchief, always with that fractured voice saying something I'd never be able to translate. I'd wake up with my chest tight, like I'd been sleeping on the wrong side of the war. One day, a letter came to camp, from the capital. It was for me. Said my sister had lost her husband. Bombing. She was alone now, with 3 kids and a ranch falling apart from the rain. I thought about leaving, asking for a transfer, going back, being useful to someone who needed me on the other side. But when I went to tell him, I didn't need to say a word. He knew. He looked at me with a sadness that shattered me. Then he picked up a stick, drew a symbol in the dirt I didn't recognize, and beside it, drew 2 dots touching. Then he handed me the handkerchief, and for the first time he said a word I understood completely. Stay. So I stayed. And in that moment I realized his language had become my secret, a secret stitched between our breaths. A code no one else could use, because it was glued together with pain, risk, and hidden tenderness. The war story we were living no longer fit inside medical reports. It was made of long stares, of hands unsure if they were allowed to touch, of nights stolen from time. And that language, it was the only place where we could exist without the fear of being erased. I went weeks without speaking English with my heart, just with my body. And every time his name crossed my mind, a name I'd never dare say out loud, I translated it not with letters, but with feeling. It was warmth. It was ache. It was something like, "You're still here, even if the world says you're not." And it was true. Because when someone teaches you a language that doesn't exist in any dictionary, they're also teaching you how to remember everything, even when war tries to make you forget. Some people think war never sleeps, that it's always wide-eyed, grinding its teeth, waiting for the next explosion. But that's not how it is. War needs to rest too, even if just in crumbs of time. And it was in those crumbs that I learned how to breathe again, because there were nights, rare, quiet, almost illegal, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The gunfire stopped. The helicopters vanished. Even the moans in the infirmary softened into whispers. It was as if hell itself had dozed off. And it was in those little naps that we found each other. There were no promises, no scheduled time. It just happened. I'd leave the tent slowly, pretending I needed something from the supply hut or water for the dressings. And he was already there, always before me, sitting on a thick root near the trunk that leaned over the riverbank. Legs pulled in, the red handkerchief tied around his ankle like he was tying down his fate so it wouldn't run off again. I'd sit beside him in silence. Sometimes I brought a canteen with warm tea, other times just my hands. And for a few minutes, we were nothing but 2 worn-out presences under a cracked sky. He taught me how to listen to the forest. He'd show me the sounds of certain night birds, the way the leaves rustled when the wind was hotter, the subtle shift when an animal passed nearby. He taught me to close my eyes and recognize the type of silence. Because there are many. The silence of guilt, the silence of fear, the silence of goodbye, and ours was the silence of survival, the kind you keep not out of cowardice but necessity, because if we talked too much, everything could fall apart. The night was the only place where we could exist together. There were no questions, no plans, just the now. One night he offered me a fruit, small, dark, almost bitter, and he just looked at me, waiting for me to take it. It wasn't just food. It was trust. He didn't say it, but his eyes did. "If you eat this," Then you see me. I ate it. The taste lingered in my mouth for days. Earthy, hard to swallow, but real. After that, he started showing me more. Strips of cloth hidden in his clothes, a necklace made of bone and seeds, a button that had belonged to his brother. Or at least, that's what I understood. Each object came with a story he couldn't tell in words, but that I learned to read with my soul. In return, I started bringing pieces of me. A button from my uniform, a piece of the letter from my sister, the one that said her husband had died, a faded picture of me as a child in Kentucky. It was like we were two archaeologists digging through what was left of our humanity in a place where nothing felt whole anymore. And it was strange, you know, because there I was, sitting in the mud with a man my flag called the enemy, and I felt safer than I ever had in my life. The war stories the world knows are made of bullets, maps, and announced victories. But the real war stories are made of those quiet nights, those crumbs of tenderness we steal from time. The way he'd rest his shoulder gently against mine like asking permission to exist. The way he offered me a cloth to wipe my forehead, not even knowing I was crying. The way, even wounded, he made sure I sat on the safe side of the tree, in case someone came. That was a kind of love that never said its name out loud, but echoed in everything we did for each other. The night was our hideout, our language, our body. When the sun threatened to rise, we'd drift apart. Go back to what the uniform said we were. Me, a nurse. Him, an unofficial prisoner. Me, an American citizen. Him, a line on a report no one wanted to complete. But for a few hours, just a few, the war would sleep, and while it slept, we lived, even if it was brief. Even if it was wrong. Even if it was just a comma in a paragraph of tragedy. I don't know how many nights there were. I didn't count. I was afraid that if I did, it would end. But each one of them is carved into my body. Even now, when the wind shifts, or the moon feels closer to the ground, I feel it. Like part of him is still sitting on that route, waiting for me to arrive with the canteen and the crumpled letter in my pocket. Waiting for the world to give us one more crack, one more pause, one more chance to remember that before we were soldiers or flags, we were just people trying not to die inside. And maybe that's why I never told this part to anyone. Because it doesn't fit in manuals or medals. It only fits in that kind of memory that aches like a wound never stitched quite right, but one you'd never trade for any medicine in the world. Because back then, even with everything falling apart around us, the night belonged to us. I woke up that morning to the sound of rushed footsteps and tense voices. It was a different kind of chaos, the kind that only shows up when death's approaching without knocking. Outside the tent, the sun hadn't even stretched yet, but the clearing was already full of shadows darting around. Uniforms being straightened with bare hands, canteens being checked, weapons clinking like bells in some dark ritual. Something was coming, and no one seemed to know what. The air felt thicker, and the smell of gasoline clung to everything, like the forest was about to be set on fire. I stepped out of the canvas with sleep still glued to my eyes and suspicion tightening my chest. Then I saw him. My heart froze in my throat like a stone sinking in the river. He was standing, silent, head bowed. But what paralyzed me was the uniform. It wasn't his. Not the worn, stained one he always tucked under layers of torn cloth. This one was clean, new, crisp. The same kind worn by the men who'd bombed us just a week before. The enemy's uniform. He was dressed like a threat, wrapped in blame. Like someone had hung a sign on him that said, "This one here can be sacrificed now." It took me a minute to understand. Then I heard one of the doctors whispering beside me that they were recycling uniforms to throw off the enemy, that they were sending wounded men to infiltrate enemy units, dressed in the clothes of the dead. It was a dirty tactic, and dangerous, and my heart knew. He didn't choose this. They'd strap that uniform on him the way you leash a wounded dog and send it across a minefield. He didn't look at me. Not then. But his hands were shaking. And at the edge of his fingers I saw it. He still wore the handkerchief, tied now around his wrist, almost hidden by the sleeve of that false uniform. That saved me, because it reminded me that he was still in there, still him. But on the outside, they had turned him into something else, into someone he wasn't, into someone they could kill without question, without regret. I wanted to scream, to run to him, to rip that uniform off and drag him back to the riverbank where we existed without names. But the words wouldn't come, because war silences too. It spits orders in your face, then swallows your tongue before you can speak the truth. I stood there, frozen, my eyes burning, my nails digging into my palms like maybe pain could distract my chest from what was happening. Later in the tent, I heard he'd been sent to an advanced post, that he was carrying out an infiltration mission. No one said more. No one wanted to know, because knowing means feeling. And in that place, feeling too much was a luxury reserved for those who hadn't seen enough blood. But I felt. And when night came, I went to the place where we used to meet. And he wasn't there. For the first time, the fallen tree trunk sat empty. The root, damp and lonely. The wind tapped the dry branch like a hand knocking on a door no one would open. And I sat right there, on the ground, not caring about the thorns. And I cried. I cried with rage, with helplessness, with fear. But most of all, I cried because I knew that wrong uniform might erase him from the world before anyone even learned his real name. The next morning I found something he'd left for me. A button. Just one. Wrapped in a piece of cloth, tucked inside my aluminum cup. It was from his original uniform. The one he used to wear when he was just a man trying to heal. Before he became a pawn in the hands of invisible commanders. It was a clear gesture. A letter without letters. A goodbye without sound. I kept the button with the handkerchief. Started sleeping with both under my makeshift pillow. As if that was all I had left of him. A button, a piece of cloth, and a hidden memory. In the days that followed, my routine felt hollow. My shifts dragged longer, the voices around me more distant. My eyes stayed fixed on the dirt road, as if he might reappear at any moment, dressed as himself. But time passed, and no one said anything. Not about the mission, not about the unit, not about him. It was like the jungle had swallowed him whole, like that uniform had done its job of erasing him from the camp's memory. And yet, I kept hearing. At night, when everything went still, I could hear his voice. Not with my ears, but with my body. I heard the sounds he made, teaching me strange words. Heard his light steps brushing the leaves. And on nights when the rain was soft and thin, I swear, I could feel his breath near the back of my neck. Like he was there, asking me not to forget him. Like he was saying, "This uniform isn't me." The war story they promised me when I enlisted spoke of honor, courage, saving lives. But no one told me that sometimes the life you want to save is dressed in the wrong clothes. And because of that, the world feels entitled to bury it quietly. That was the day I lost faith in uniforms and started believing only in hands. Because only hands tell the truth. And his always told me he was a man before he was an enemy. Wounded before he was guilty. Mine? Before he was lost. After he left. And the tree trunk where we used to meet sat empty night after night. The war lost what little logic had kept my feet on the ground. My steps grew heavier, the sheets colder, the radio's static sharper. Like everything was covered in a thin layer of dust no one bothered to wipe away. My hands kept stitching flesh, cleaning wounds, checking pulses. But the rest of my body had no idea where it belonged anymore. I moved like someone looking for something that never had a name. Or maybe it did. But it had been stripped away with the wrong uniform they forced on him. That's the fog I walked through every day. It was on one of those muggy mornings, the kind where sweat rolled down your neck before the sun even showed up, that I noticed the loose floorboard. It had always creaked louder than the others in the infirmary. I'd tripped over it dozens of times. But that morning my feet caught differently. Like they'd been tugged. Like the wood itself was tired of hiding. I crouched down, lifted the board with the handle of my forceps, and what I saw left me speechless for a long stretch of minutes. A piece of cloth, folded carefully, wrapped around something, tucked between the beams, hidden like a secret only silence knew. My fingers brushed the fabric like one would stroke a missing face. It was his handkerchief. The same one. The same I'd seen tied around his ankle, his wrist, his waist. It had dry stains. Time, dirt, maybe blood. And inside it, there were things. A shard of mirror, a dark wooden button, and a strand of red thread. That was all. But to me, it was the whole universe. A wordless journal from a man who knew he might never return. A silent will, left not for someone to understand, but for someone who already did. I pressed the cloth to my chest and trembled all over. I sat right there on the infirmary's hard floor, as the shift started around me, and let the tears rise slow. No one saw me. Or if they did, they pretended not to. Because that war was built on pretending. Some pretended they didn't know. Others, that they didn't feel. And me, I pretended that the handkerchief was just a piece of fabric. But it wasn't. It was him. It was his presence stitched into silence. It was the language I had learned the hard way, embroidered with red thread. I started carrying it with me, hidden in the pocket of my overalls. It became a ritual. Whenever the day got too heavy, whenever the screams from the amputee ward got too loud, whenever the faces of the wounded blurred into the ghosts of the night before, I'd slip my hand into my pocket, feel the cloth, the button, the thread, and breathe. It was my way of not losing my mind, of remembering that not everything was ruins, that there was, in fact, a war story being written in silence. And it was real. It was mine. It was his. It was ours. I also began writing. Tiny phrases on bits of paper I stole from the infirmary's file cabinet. Not full sentences. I didn't want to risk them being read. Just loose words, written in the blend of sounds I'd picked up from him. Words that to anyone else would have looked like nonsense. But to me, they were sacred. I hid the papers beneath the floorboards, next to the cloth. That corner of the room became a shrine, a makeshift sanctuary of everything the war tried to erase. One afternoon, while sweeping the outer ward, I saw a nurse heading toward that spot. My heart jumped. My throat dried up. I rushed over with a bucket, faked a trip, spilled water all over the floor, anything to steer her away. She cursed at me, wet and annoyed, but left. And the handkerchief was safe. And me, though shaking, felt invincible. Because protecting that piece of cloth had become my secret mission. A quiet protest against erasure. A care that no one could take from me. And on a night darker than the rest, when the generator failed and we were without power for hours, I sat on top of that floorboard and stayed there, just feeling the weight of my body over what was left of him. I closed my eyes and imagined him sitting too, somewhere far, with his hand on some leftover piece of me. Maybe a lock of hair, a dried flower, a whisper kept in the bone. I imagined he knew it still existed, and for a moment, just one, I didn't feel alone. That cloth under the board became my most intimate secret, more than any letter, more than any medal, more than any memory. It was a secret that never asked to be revealed, only to be protected. And maybe, in some language only the heart speaks, that's the real meaning of loving someone during a war. Loving without shouting their name, without telling the story, without asking for more. Just guarding, caring, hiding beneath worn-out wood, where no one would think to look. Because the world only pays attention to victories shouted, never to gestures whispered. To this day, when I step on hollow floorboards, my whole body remembers. Memory lives in the feet, you know? In how we dodge the creak. In how we bend over something that needs to stay hidden. That was my altar, my reliquary. My way of loving him without anyone noticing. And sometimes I wonder, did he do the same? Was there, on the other side, a loose board too? A cloth from me? A piece of myself tucked away in silence? Maybe. Maybe not. But the red thread is still here. And when the world goes too quiet, I run it between my fingers and remember, there was once someone who knew how to stitch love into the heart of destruction. It was a night far too hot for a war zone. The kind where the wind doesn't blow, the sweat never dries, and even the frogs seem too breathless to sing. The air stood still, heavy, like something was lurking, but not yet brave enough to bare its teeth. I'd learned to read those signs by then. The forest going stiff like a statue, the smell of the ground changing color, the patrol dogs going silent. It was like the world had clutched its heart, holding it in tight, just seconds away from releasing a scream no one would ever forget. I was in the mess hall, folding napkins no one would use, when the first blast tore through the ceiling. The earth shook under my feet like a wounded beast. The floorboards cracked, the tin roof shifted like paper. And for one moment, I forgot who I was. I just ran without knowing where to, like following my own pain. And my body took me to him. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. Next thing I knew, I was sprinting past the edge of the infirmary, cutting through tents, hearing machine guns firing from every direction. And then I saw it, the makeshift tent where they'd hidden him, in flames. The fire raged upward like furious arms, devouring canvas, wood, and every possibility he might have been. I screamed, a scream that ripped through my throat and came from a place inside me I didn't even know existed. I screamed like screaming could carve a tunnel between death and life. I ran straight toward the fire, arms slicing through the heat, eyes blurred with smoke, heart pounding outside my chest. A soldier tried to stop me, but I dodged him, pushed through the burning tarp and stepped inside. He was there, curled in on himself, legs twitching, mouth slightly open, like he was calling for air, or for me. And when he saw me, he smiled, a small, crooked, scorched smile. But it was a smile. It was him. I wrapped myself around him with every ounce of strength I had, grabbed the back of his neck, pulled him by the shoulders, threw myself down with him. We rolled together through ash, mud, and scraps of burning cloth. When I finally dragged him out of the tent, the smoke had swallowed everything. People were screaming, bullets cutting through the sky, and the world seemed to be spitting fire in every direction. But right there between my lap and his chest, there was only one sound, the sound of life trying to hang on. He was hurt. Bad. The left side of his face covered in soot and blood, a chunk of wood lodged in his leg, and the smell of burned skin. I cried without tears, just broken sobs, a tremble shaking my bones, whispering, "Don't let him die here. Not now. Not like this." I carried him to the supply tent, hid him between bundles of gauze, and hung a wet cloth over the entrance. I grabbed everything I could: morphine, alcohol, needles, bandages. And I stitched with trembling hands, with blood-soaked knees, with a chest full of wreckage. He didn't say a word, just breathed. Each breath was a relief, a miracle, a reminder that even when the world explodes around you, there are still cracks where love can slip through. The war story they promised me never mentioned this, that in the middle of the apocalypse you can hold someone in your arms and realize you're still alive. We stayed like that for hours. Me cleaning, him surviving. The explosions slowly faded, like the world's anger had burned itself out. And when dawn came thick with fog and morning, I looked into his face and knew he wasn't going to make it. Maybe a day, maybe two. But the war had bitten too deep. His body was a marked card. And in that moment I understood. My mission wasn't to save him anymore. It was to love him through the end, however I could, with whatever time was left, with whatever hands I still had, with a heart that, even in pieces, still beat only for him. That night, there were no heroes, no victories, only loss, chaos, goodbyes disguised as hope. And most of all, there was us, surrounded by ash, trying to protect the final flicker of a love the world had tried to stamp out. The cloth I used to wrap his chest was mine. His handkerchief ended up in my pocket. We switched without realizing, as if our bodies already knew what to do when our minds no longer could. And to this day, whenever thunder sounds louder than it should, my whole body goes back to that night, to that burning ground, to that broken breath, and to that silent knowing that not even fire, nor bullets, nor forgetting could destroy what we had between us. Because when the world exploded around me, I clung to him, and in his eyes, I found the most unexpected piece of my life. In war, the first thing to die isn't the body. It's the right to grieve, to say goodbye, to offer the tenderness of a final gesture. Because when someone's labeled as being on the wrong side, even death becomes punishment. That's what I learned the day he stopped breathing, and they forbade me from burying him. The end came quietly, on a suffocating afternoon. No breeze, no omen. I was sitting beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, his handkerchief resting on my lap. His breathing was shallow, barely there, and his eyes, they were open, but unfocused, like he had already begun to leave before his body gave in. I held his hand, the same hand that used to tremble when offering me a flower, and whispered the one word he taught me clearly: stay. But he didn't stay. His final breath came soft, like a thread of wind snuffing out a candle. No twitch, no sound, just a silence that hurt more than any bomb. I stayed there, forehead pressed to his, waiting for time to give back what it had just taken. But in that war, time only took, and it took without guilt. When I finally realized he was really gone, I began to care for the body. I washed him gently, like my grandmother did with newborns in our family. I used clean gauze, diluted soap, and scented his hands with leaves I'd picked near the riverbank. I bandaged his chest, covered his feet, and placed the wooden button he'd given me days before over his heart, wrapped in the same handkerchief. That's when they arrived. 2 soldiers, young, cold. One was reading off a clipboard while the other stared at the body with a mix of disgust and boredom. "This one doesn't count," they said. "He's not one of ours." I froze. I asked what they were going to do with him. One of them replied without even looking at me. "Protocol is to leave him behind. No record, no burial. That's what happens with unidentifieds." I jumped to my feet. My voice came out rough, cracked, desperate. "He has a name. He fought. He bled beside us. But it was like shouting at a stone wall. They didn't answer, just turned their backs and walked away, leaving death there, like garbage. I knelt beside him and cried, not from sorrow, from rage. That wasn't fair. It wasn't human. Burying a body isn't a privilege. It's the last act of love anyone can offer. And they denied me that. Denied him the dignity life never gave him. A proper end. So I made a choice. Alone. No permission. No help. I would bury him with my own hands. He deserved more than abandonment. More than oblivion. And if no one else cared, then let it be me. It had always been me. I waited for nightfall, took a rusted shovel from beside the makeshift kitchen, wrapped his body in a clean infirmary sheet, wrote a single word at the edge of the fabric with a burned piece of charcoal. Existed. I carried him to the clearing by the river, the same place where he taught me to hear the forest's sounds. I dug slowly, my whole body shaking, my back on fire, the world asleep around me. The soil was hard, full of roots. But I didn't stop. I dug until the grave was deep enough to protect him from being forgotten. I laid him down gently, placed the handkerchief over his face, and instead of a cross, I planted a crooked branch from a fallen tree. I didn't say a prayer. I didn't know one that fit. But I sang, softly, first in English, then in his language, then just in sound. A lullaby laced with grief and tenderness, a song that said, "You were loved, you were remembered, you were mine." I returned to the filthy infirmary, hands caked in dirt, hair tangled, chest raw. No one asked where I'd been. No one noticed I was gone. Or they noticed and chose silence, as always, as everyone did. But I knew that beneath that damp earth lay more than a body. There was a war story no headline would ever print, a forbidden love buried alongside the wrong uniform, and a piece of me that would never come back whole. Even now when I smell wet soil, my body bends instinctively, as if still kneeling in that clearing. And when I pass by cemeteries, seeing tombstones with names, dates, and flowers, I think of him, of the grave that never bore a name, of the beautiful story no one ever dared to hear, and the cruel truth that, for most, he's still just the body they refused to bury. But to me, he's every name I ever learned to love in silence, and that patch of ground hidden among the trees is the most sacred altar of my life. The forest doesn't keep everything. It swallows, chews, and then spits back whatever it wants. Almost never what you expect. After I buried his body in that clearing, I went back every day for a week, like someone checking on a newborn just to make sure it's still breathing. I brought dry leaves, wilted flowers, small objects I found along the path. A piece of a buckle, a strip of cloth, a broken seed. Each item was an offering. Not for him. He was already gone. But for me. I had to keep that space alive because it was the only place where I still felt whole. Outside of it, I was just another night shift nurse. But there I was, a woman, a guardian, a witness, and a widow to a love no one recorded. A month later, they ordered us out. The base was dismantled, the outpost evacuated. The war moved to other shores. They said the terrain was unstable, dangerous, not worth holding. I wanted to protest. I wanted more time, one more visit, one last goodbye that felt real. But, as always, the decision had been made long before I ever heard the question. I packed my things with empty hands. I took nothing visible. Just his handkerchief tucked inside the pocket of my overalls. And the button, of course, sewn inside my collar. That was all I had left. All I could carry. Time passed the way it does after war. Slow and unfinished. I returned to the U.S., settled in the backwoods of Minnesota, and survived the best I could. I volunteered at a rural hospital, then a nursing home. I never worked in an ER again. I never stepped inside a tent again. I was never the same again. For years I avoided talking about that time. Not out of fear, but out of respect. I knew that if I touched that memory, I might fall apart. And when you live alone in a trailer beside a lake, you can't afford to fall apart without an audience. You learn to stitch your pain quietly. But there was one day, just one, when the forest gave back what it had swallowed. It was a cloudy afternoon. I was going through one of the old boxes I kept under the bed. Those you only open when you need to remember who you once were. At the bottom of the box, between yellowed papers and a photo whose faces had long faded, I found the handkerchief. Not the one I carried with me. The other one. The one he had left for me in secret. Wrapped inside it was a small piece of paper. Thin, folded many times. The texture was strange, almost like skin. When I unfolded it, I saw a drawing made with dried blood. And ink. And charcoal. A map. But it wasn't a map of war. No routes, no numbers, no coordinates. It was an intimate map. A rough sketch of the forest, with the river in the center and two circular marks near the bank. One was drawn darker, like he'd pressed his finger down when making it, and beside it, the outline of a handkerchief. A symbol. A sign meant only for me. The second mark was smaller, nearly faded, and around it he had written something in his language. Just 3 words. But I knew the sound. It was the same he used when he taught me the word for return. I shook, all over. My vision blurred. I felt that paper was a calling, an old plea finally unearthed. He had drawn the place I should go. Maybe where he hoped I would find him again. Or maybe where he'd left something. Something beyond the body. Beyond the button. Beyond the handkerchief. The next week I boarded a bus to the airport. I told no one. Sold some old silver pieces, traded what I could, and flew with no plan. I arrived in the country that once held our brief story, with my heart in my hands and time heavy on my shoulders. The forest had changed. Thicker. Wilder. But my body remembered the way. Strange how our feet remember better than our minds. I walked for hours. Slept under the open sky, followed feeling more than direction. And it was when I stopped looking that I found it. A clearing, small, shallow, still marked by a rise in the ground, now blanketed in moss and roots. Beside it, a stone, smooth, white, with a single flower growing from its cracks. And beneath the stone, a hollow, inside a folded cloth. And inside the cloth, another map. But this one was different. It was a drawing of me, from behind, with a handkerchief around my neck, and one sentence, in English, written with struggle, with crooked letters, but clear. This is where I kept you safe. My chest hurt in a way I still can't explain. It was like every night I had dreamed of him collapsed into that one moment. I fell to my knees, forehead against the damp earth, and let the world spill from my eyes. Not in sorrow, but in recognition. He had left me a trail, a trace, a map not drawn with ink, but with blood, memory, and hope. Because in the end, the real war story we lived wasn't made of battles won or bodies counted. It was made of invisible maps, of hidden gestures, of unlabeled love. And from that place, in that forgotten clearing, I knew he had loved me with everything he had, and left me the one sign no one else could ever understand. Only me. Sometimes time doesn't pass. It just hides. It lingers behind the closet door, tucked inside forgotten sheets, in the static hum of a radio that never shuts up at night. in the groaning floorboards of a trailer when the wind shifts. I've lived alone for years by this quiet lake, and I swear I've learned how to hear time when it's standing still. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And that night, it whispered his name. I had left the window open, like I always do when the air gets too heavy to sleep. The sound of the water tapping against the hull of the trailer was calm, almost hypnotic. But something was different about that night, a weight in the air, an absence that felt like presence, as if someone was standing outside, silent, waiting for me to notice. And I did. I got up slowly, feet meeting the cold floor. The curtains swayed and the smell of damp forest drifted through the room. I picked up my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to scare off whatever was there. The memory, the ghost, the echo. Whatever name people give that kind of thing. I opened the door carefully, and there he was. Not in flesh, not in bone, but in shape, in shadow, in undeniable presence. Mist was rising off the lake in thin columns, and there, in the middle of it, stood a silhouette. Same posture, same line of the jaw, the shoulders, the hands clasped in front of the body. It was him. And I wasn't afraid. Not at all. Because something inside me already knew this moment would come. The air around me warmed like summer had returned for a breath. I felt weightless, and my heart quiet. For the first time in years, I stepped forward. He didn't move. He didn't have to. Just being there was movement enough. I sat down on the trailer steps, fingers wrapped around my red-beaded necklace, and let time catch up to us. The silence between us was old, familiar. I knew he wouldn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything was already said, in the way the wind brushed against my cheek, in the way the oak leaves behind the trailer rustled like his voice, in the sound of the water, always the water, repeating the rhythm of what we'd once been. I sat there for minutes I couldn't count, maybe hours, and then I saw. He was holding something, a handkerchief. The same one. The edge was torn, stained, and for a second his silhouette lifted it to his chest. A slow gesture like someone offering back something that was never truly taken. And when the cloth touched the air in front of me, he vanished, dissolved, like he'd been made of vapor. But the handkerchief remained. Dropped on the ground, wet with dew, folded with care. I picked it up with hands that shook more from reverence than cold, and stitched into the fabric, with dark thread, was a single word, just one, sewn by hand, with uneven stitches, like someone learning to write with a needle. Stay. I stayed, because that was the answer to every question I'd asked myself after the war. I stayed alive. I stayed in the world. I stayed by the lake. I stayed with his memory as my only true companion. I stayed even when I wasn't sure anyone remembered I existed. And there, with the cloth in my hands and the sky just beginning to lighten, I understood that the love we lived through didn't die. It just changed shape. It became rain. It became wind. It became the sound of my trailer's wooden boards when the silence gets too loud. He came back that night to remind me that the war story we carried doesn't end when the body stops. It continues as gesture, as ritual, as soft, lingering presence. And that's why, that morning, after placing the handkerchief back in the box where I keep what I love most, I decided it was time to tell everything. Not so the world would understand, but so I could remember that I lived, that I loved, that I fought for something that didn't fit in any uniform. He came back, and he didn't need to speak, because when a love is real, it comes back, even if only to sit in silence with you for one more night. Not everyone will understand this story. And honestly, I don't think it was ever meant to be understood by everyone. Because there are war stories that don't belong in the victories the world loves to clap for. There are stories that don't fit inside flags, or parades, or golden medals. There are stories born in the dark, and they only survive because someone kept them quiet. This was mine. I didn't tell it out of longing. I told it because I needed to remember that I was more than the hands that stopped the bleeding. I was more than the woman scrubbing the infirmary floors while planes split the sky. I was more than the uniform. I was shelter. I was a pause. I was solid ground in a war that spared no one. And all of that was because of someone who showed up on the wrong side, with the right heart. For years I thought loving during wartime was a mistake, a slip made only by fools. But now I understand. Loving during war is a form of resistance. It's writing in blood and silence, a story the world can't erase. And that's why I'm still here. Old, yes. Forgotten by many, maybe. But whole. Because the love I lived wasn't small. It was big enough to survive distance, and loss, and time, and even forgetting. If you've listened this far, thank you. From the bottom of my tired heart, thank you. Maybe you're carrying something too. A name only you remember. A photo with no face. A loose button in a drawer no one else understands. And if that's the case, know that I see you. Because there are things only those who've lived in silence can recognize in another's eyes. We find each other in what's missing, in words never spoken, in memories still breathing quietly at the bottom of the box. So if this story touched something in you, stay a little longer. Leave a comment below. Tell me if you've ever had to hide a love inside your clothes, or stitch memory into the hem of your soul. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep hearing stories like this. Stories that are emotional, yes. But more than that, stories that matter. Because some things should never die, and love is one of them. Good night, my dear. The water's still tapping on the hull of my trailer, and for a moment, it feels like he's still here. And maybe he is.